Welcome. So I think we're back, and I have a beautiful little program I'm excited to offer. In today's program, it's about the direction of the south and the throne of the sun, and how rapid growth and expansion, comes with this increased heat that then causes friction. And so there's a connection that um, is there, also to this idea of, like the expansion creates connection, which then asks us to make love or make war. And so it's also in this direction of the south and the throne of the sun, the center of light and warmth. And that center is in the human, in the heart, which is the seat of the soul. So, and it's interesting because in some systems the understanding is that the heart of the planet is actually the human heart in its full and undefended state. So it is a sensory organ, the heart, that actually perceives light information from outside of the visible spectrum. So, the sun is illuminating everything on earth, and everything comes from the earth. And yet, our eyes can only see a very, very tiny aspect of this. And so I think they're beginning to really understand that the human heart is this amazing organ that is perceiving all of this electromagnetic energy from within and around us. So I'm going to bring these kind of two pieces together in our show today. So let's dive deeper into the summer. And here in Virginia, there's this, heat wave, that we're experiencing. I think it's pretty well across the nation, right? And so it is in the south, in the direction of the summer, considered to be like the exaltation of the sun, the throne of the sun. And in the medicine wheel, it's this direction of rapid growth and expansion and adventure, right? So when heat comes, everything expands, and people move around, and take trips, and but everything else, the air is expanding, the oceans are expanding, everything is expanding. And in this expansion, um, it's like, again, travel happens, movement, much more movement, in all levels. And so, this is really part of the blessing of Father Son. And in this time frame, we have the Father's Days, including the Founding Fathers Day coming up, right? And summer solstice. And so these are all the times of the mysteries of the heart, and that can be invoked here. And in expansion, like I said, when we expand, it challenges, the spaces, all our boundaries, all our borders. And so we're seeing oftentimes, like in expansion, that there's maybe an increase of war, an increase of territorial sort of skirmish and strife. So we'll go into more of this a little later. We had spoke previously about the power of the South and the challenges and opportunities that this direction provides through the active, expansive season of the summer. So as the sun increases the heat in our hemisphere, the heat causes expansion, causes the growth, of the plants, movement, of the air flows, and movement of bodies. Things are moving around a lot more. And that actually brings us out of ourselves and into the world, where we connect and impact others, right? So we either rub them the right or the wrong way. Like we're moving out, beyond our usual space, and then we're interacting and connecting, and sometimes that's a pleasant experience, and sometimes it seems that it ruffles feathers, and we get into like a kind of hostile interaction, because we're trying to, make people back out of our space in some way. And so it's like when we make contact, it sort of inevitably leads to love or war. And I think there's an interesting, koan there, lesson, something to contemplate, right? Like, I mean, maybe they're both equally as desirable in some ways, right? Or just both forces of nature, and there's nothing that we can do, that or should do, um, but just assume that that's part of the cycles of life and nature. But I think it also asks us to look deeper at, how the expansion and connection, through love might create a different possibility on Earth. And so, anyway, South is about expansion, and that brings us into new relationships. And it seems that those relationships, then part of what we need to do is learn how to learn communication with respect, to interact in a way that's conscious and aware in a way of the other, and wanting, to honor and respect the other as much as we want to be honored and respected ourselves. And of course, this is an old rule, often called the Golden Rule. It's actually found in every religion in the world, but it's a kind of an interesting, again, principle and balance, I think, that we need to include in our exploration here. So, because of the shrinking gold, or globe, gold too, and expanding populations, we are igniting in this collective time of endings. The old empire collapses stories of old, and expansion leads us into global conflict, and people seem to want to support expansionists and make sure that they have their share before someone else gets it. Right? It's interesting, that this time we're in globally, right? Is this time where communications and population and everything is, shrinking this globe, and there's, maybe even, too much of populations to have a right carrying capacity. I mean, the Earth, like any other environment, has a certain carrying capacity for what it can support. And, this is part of the story we're in, the explosion of proliferation of life in the summer is, this amazing thing that is this marriage between the Earth and the sun. And it's what, gives us all this free energy, for this growth and expansion. And yet, there is a balance, and nature is all about balance. And so that's, the summer isn't the only you know season that we have, that the cycles excuse me, bring about balance, and that, nature creates balance in all kinds of different ways. So, like as we're in this expansion, and in a way we're kind of at the ending of a time period as well, which would be more like in the direction of the north. But, in the endings, collective times of the endings, where the old empire is collapsing, then there's like, more opportunism, new things happening, and different forces moving in the planet, and in some ways biologically necessarily so, almost, so we see a lot of immigration, and some of that may be political, right? But it's a kind of response in a way that is, also in the ending reaching out for the new beginning, which comes. And so you see, even in the drought stressed trees, oftentimes they really produce lots and lots of seeds, right? Because their orientation is towards the coming generations, right? And trying to find that way forward in many experiments and possibilities. So, everything that we're watching here is really, a part of sort of this balancing in nature and these kind of flows of nature. And a part of our question is, that there's sort of like two aspects of the Father. Which will we follow, the Father of war and destruction, or the Father of connectivity, cooperation, and positive expansion, symbiosis, synthesis, right? And maybe it's not even a choice, so it's kind of like we're here as students. Never before have we witnessed, collectively, this kind of process of civilizational. People have been through these before, but I don't know that. I think we have more consciousness now, and so we're learning about this. And I don't know that anybody has any answers, but it is, to look at the questions that it's posing, and to keep, seeking, where is the balance, where is the collective wholeness, because that's what we are. So, again, heart-based relationships, right, would support respect for boundaries and opportunity through cooperation and synthesis and generativity. And, this is sort of the positive role of the Father, an apt metaphor for the sun and its relationship to the earth. So everything that's happening on the earth is generated, is fueled by the sun. And we use only a tiny amount of the vast energies it generates. The sun is the source of life on our planet, and the time of summer in the south on the medicine wheel, is that honoring of that strength of the sun. Another good metaphor for the sun, I think, is like the heart of the planetary system and the center of the system. So a Cherokee teacher that I knew, Mama Mary Sunbeam, once told me regarding the heat of the sweat lodge, that the heated stones in the center of the lodge are the grandfathers, and they're heated by the sun through the agency of the wood that, was created through the sun and then becomes what is combusting, to make the fire that heats the stones. And all of that, like it is made from sunlight and earth. And then in combusting and burning, it becomes the sun again. And it releases the light and the heat into this sacred fire, and the sacred fire infuses the stones. And then in the lodge, if we can remember to not fear the heat, to recognize it as love, then we can relax into it, and it actually, makes it easier to be in that space of the lodge, especially if the temperature feels a little warmer. You're having, some contraction in the body through the resistance, through the fear. And that's where expansion becomes really helpful, and if we can lean back into expansion, if we can relax out of tension, and allow our own inner flows as well, that helps us be regulated and feel comfortable and safe. So Mama Mary said that the heat of the stones was love, and that we needed to relax to receive it. And sometimes love is hot and uncomfortable, and sometimes love is really deeply wonderful and nourishing. And so being centered in the heart and just accepting the experiences in the heart is the first step to sort of knowing what is needed in different experiences, different instances. So we can, it's not like we're supposed to just be, um, open to anything and everything. But if we close before we're experiencing and knowing what it is, then we really are not being guided very clearly in our lives. It's like we're reacting to the past, we're limiting ourselves, and so we can't do our natural expansion of our life into the world, right? So going back to the idea of the center, the sun, the generative force of all life on earth, and as the earth circles and circles this great star that we're close to, it's like we can sense this heart of the solar system. And, it's like there's something that is, I think, related when we tune into our heart, like the physical organ and also the heart chakra in the body. And again, in the West, we often think that our center is our head, the mind, the directing intelligence that seems to come from the brain in our modern understanding. But that's being challenged and expanded now by the science of the heart brain and the gut brain. And also, we've always known of intuition or felt senses and gut feelings. And when the indigenous peoples are asked, they point to themselves like they're saying I am. They don't point to their head. And I don't know that many people do. We point to the chest, to the heart center. And so, it's kind of part of our shifting out of our identification with ourselves up in the mind, and kind of lowering, dropping, in some ways maybe humbling ourselves into this heart space. And that as we're understanding that the brain really is more like a receiver, right? And it's where these thoughts come from, where these ideas come from. It's like we're still not finding it in the brain itself, right? So that's the idea now is more like it's like an antenna. And then the heart is like the biggest electromagnetic field in the body. So it's both sending and receiving energy in much greater magnitude than our brains. And we're discovering that this is a deeper center also of the heart. When we reconnect to that center, we're actually in communication with this larger field of life. And we can maybe sense what is needed moment to moment in response to the world. And it's kind of like it's not from the mind that's working in the past or the future. It's in this here now moment of being in our senses. And then we can know in that moment, what appropriate response is. And as we're tuning into what is around us and reading that clearly through this, receptive, sensory organ of the heart, then we can respond in a way that, will more than anything help us. We'll begin having our inner knowing, our intuition, and we'll find our way through, this time of both expansion and maybe peril or, those kinds of things. So tune in when you point to yourself. Do you point naturally to your head or your heart? And then just notice, like, can you drop down? The heart is sort of an instrument of connection, and it needs to be at peace before we can create peace. And we can't really even be aware of what's going on in our hearts when we're not aware, feeling, present in that way. And so a lot of people, especially in our Western civilization, sort of, we do live from our heads. And so below our necks, we might not even sense our body very well. And the heart is a very sensitive instrument. And early on, it was hurt and broken in ways that we didn't even understand, and nobody did, right? But we didn't like to feel this pain. And so to move on in life, we sort of abandoned the heart and the body in general. And again, it's understandable, but it's not the solution. It's what the guide would call the pseudo solution. So we developed our defenses and, turned to that to try to protect this sensitive heart. But we have to come back into embodiment with our spirit and to feel this power of the central sun that is our hearts. The protection of the defense, like erroneously reads the heart as weak, and the energies that, may be difficult, it feels like it has to freeze or numb, so it doesn't, so we can kind of avoid it, right? And in that way, we abandon the heart and numb the body. And in the moment, it may seem to help, like maybe we don't feel the full brunt of our momentary loss or our momentary, shame or whatever is happening that we're not wanting to feel. But in the long run, it cripples us, and we don't access our inner navigational system. And so part of it is we have to remember that empowerment and sensitivity are actually synergistic, right? In our culture, we're often taught that sensitivity is something that, indicates weakness. But I think, again, we're learning like a very different understanding. And I think most people that are sensitive know, like, it's a superpower, but also you have to be a superhuman to be, like capable of being. So, like, there's a kind of way that we can approach our sensitivity, right? In a self-in presence sort of support that actually does turn it into a beautiful, empowered existence, right? In a sense of self that's firm and grounded and feels its full truth, its resilience, it doesn't need rigid defenses. So um, all of this, comes from this connection, but again, it takes a little while, and we have to overcome our conditioning around that. And often that conditioning was the first broken heart we ever had, right? Which, because nobody could even maybe understand what we were going through, or the people that we needed were unable to, be there for us for whatever reasons. It's like it, we suffered. And there's this kind of hidden memory, and a kind of way that we threw that in the closet, and we put skull and crossbones on that closet, said, never, never, never go close to this, never enter that, right? But that, what it is an old, you know, uh, grief, an old sadness. And it only becomes a wound because we don't bring it into the light and into the open to be, felt unhealed. And then we have to, protect it because it stays, unhealthy in some way. It's not the resilience that its nature would have, we, inhibit. So some of the difficulty is learning, like how to go back in and feel and be with and experience like the soft pain, right? Not the judgment, not the blame of us or others, in the suffering that we experienced, but just the simple hurt of it. Life has pain, and to the degree that we can, just accept that, and not make a big deal of it so much, and know that, you know, in the pathwork, the guide is saying, the times of struggle, the times of difficulty that we would probably call the worst times of our lives, from the soul perspective, is actually the greatest times. We are learning the most. We are, working deeply. Our hearts are, being, you know, worked in a way. So we're in this way trying to reconnect and not feel like this weakness in connection with sensitivity. So take a minute and just see, can you tune into the sensitive part of your heart and have any sense at all of the hidden strength there that maybe you didn't realize because, it felt like it was very young and small and dependent when it took this blow, right? And that you can kind of say, it's okay. We made it. We're here now. I'm stronger, maybe feel the truth of something that carried you this far. What has brought you all this way? Um, Still holding towards a process of movement and connection, towards their heart, towards their own expansion, right? The soul's expansion into life. And it has to, open and unfreeze and risk. That's the other part of the direction of the South, is that, it's a kind of risky adventure. You have to be often ignorant and youthful to make those jumps, because some old person would say, no, that's not a good thing to do. So, but it is part of the cycle, right? It's part of the divine timing of the process of our development and our growth. And so there is this time, to explore and risk beyond and grow, in ways that we wouldn't have imagined before. It's often a time when we can just relax and be. And again, that's that place of the heart that's connected with the South. And maybe, we relax and be for a little while, and then we get called to an adventure, and we go exploring, or we go risking something, right, from the ordinary. So, we can remember also, our empowerment and our sensitivity are synergistic, right? I think I said that. And so it's really not the sensitivity we need to avoid. It's more like the emotional reactivity, which is like a kind of heat inside of us that formed, around the inner conflict, right? That was originally, what, affected us. And so it's sort of like this sort of breaks out as it gets, reminded in some way, as the heat gets too close. And, so part of it is we do want to see if we can calm and relax our emotional reactivity, because then we can navigate a lot better. But it's also good to know that when we don't, that reactivity is coming into the light of consciousness. It's still serving us and being served in its transformation. Because even when we don't control it, even when we're merged with it, even when it's, just taking us over, um, ideally we don't, it runs its course. We calm down, we get a little perspective, and then we begin to see, oh, yeah, this is what is still within me, that is in terror, or confusion, or pain. And it's like it's at that moment that we can go in and be with it and hold it, and that will allow it also to integrate and resolve itself. So, the world is divided and at war. As individuals, we are also divided and at war within ourselves. And so I think really the work in a lot of ways is healing that inner war, which then will expand and help us find the way of healing the outer divisions and wars. So take a moment and see if you can imagine yourself radiating out from the heart. Feel it, visualize it. Notice if it doesn't feel comfortable, or you feel resistance to even tuning in, right? No right or wrong. Everything tells us more about ourselves. Just notice how it is for you. And just check in as you go, here and there. Just noticing, because we sometimes, because we're disconnected, don't realize that there's a lot going on in the body and in the heart center and internally. And so it's part of the direction of the West to do introspection, to look within, right? And so this heart is the center of awareness without separation. And it's kind of like a space that can connect with, the presence of love and compassion and this undefended and embodied self, right? So grounded in love, grounded in vulnerability, which seems like incredibly risky and dangerous to, most human beings. But again, because we are so afraid of it, we have never discovered the power of it. And so humanity is trying to evolve into this higher functioning of this capacity. But mostly we still defend the broken heart and don't realize the source and the power that's there. So I'm going to share with you from some information, like there's this book that I like a lot by Stephen Herod Booner called The Secret Teaching of Plants. And there's also just a bunch of research and stuff along these lines. I love the subtitle of this book. It's called The Intelligence of the Heart in the Direct Perception of Nature. So, he was using it, perceiving plants and outer nature. But the same applies when we can look at our inner experience as well, a sensory experience. So, this book begins with a deep dive into the actual functioning of the heart as it, as we understand it now. And so, like, the science is really, like I don't know if everybody, but I grew up, the heart's just this pump and it, pumps the blood, through everything. And the truth is, the heart, no way could the heart actually have the strength to pump the blood through all of our body. So let me digress a little bit and just share some information and new understanding that we have about how, this heart, all of its functions and how it works. And, it would take like hundreds of pounds of pressure for it to actually force the blood, through all of our system. There's miles of our vessels, right? And so what it does is it actually flows with a vortex of spiral movement, which is always, how things move like that. And it's also interesting the way that you balance two opposing forces. So it's an integrative thing of two oppositional forces that come together and create a spiral. So let me go back. So the human heart is increasingly understood by neurocardiologists and researchers. And there's a bunch of research that is done at the Heart Math Institute that this is coming from as well, that you might want to look up on your own. So, it's really a highly complex information processing center rather than just a mechanical pump. And so then there's a simple breakdown of the heart's broader capabilities. Even as a pump, the heart cannot do the job entirely on its own. The heart relies on the elasticity and health of the entire circulatory system to help circulate blood, functioning partly as a suction device that swirls blood rather than just forcing it. And that's the other thing, that when you create this spiral, you actually create a kind of suction involved in that. There was a naturalist in Germany that observed fish, going up a dam, right? So up a waterfall, and he noticed that the fish spun itself to when it made the leap. It also was spinning, and he realized that in the spin, the fish was actually creating a vacuum in front of it, and it was partly being lifted up the falls. So, these principles nature knows, and it's amazing for us to discover, right? Wow. So it's also an electromagnetic organ. And so we talked a little about that. The heart generates the strongest electromagnetic field in the human body, up to 5,000 times stronger than the brain. This field, which expands outward and can be measured several feet away from the body, acts as a sensory radar that continuously interacts with the environment and the electromagnetic fields of other living beings. So it's also a center of intelligence. The heart contains its own complex nervous system, often called the little brain or the heart brain, with about 40,000 sensory neurons. It learns, remembers, and makes decisions. Surprisingly, the heart sends more signals up to the head brain than the head brain sends down to the heart. And then it's also a hormone regulator. So the heart functions as an endocrine gland. It produces and secretes hormones, including ANP, which is atrial natriuretic peptide, which reduces stress hormones in the body, and oxytocin, the bonding or love hormone, which influences our emotional and social connections. So the heart, has this, again, connective kind of aspect to it. And then there's this thing called heart coherence, which is also a new thing that there's a rhythm to the heartbeat, and then that rhythm can be in a kind of state of really deep coherence, or it can be less coherent. And so they're studying all of this, and they say, as outlined by researchers, heart coherence is a state of smooth, ordered rhythm in your heartbeat over time. So when you experience positive emotions, like appreciation, gratitude, or love, so or you practice a slow rhythmic breathing, calming breath, the signals your heart sends to your brain become balanced. And this harmonious state then optimizes your brain function, lowers stress, and brings your nervous system into balance. Then there's this other thing called aesthesis and the emotional heart. And this is some of Stephen Hod-Booner's exploration of the heart's deeper functions. And he draws on this ancient Greek concept of aesthesis, which simply means the capacity for deep, holistic perception and feeling. It's kind of like a gestalt, right? Like a comprehension that's beyond the analytical, levels of the brain. Rather than viewing the heart mainly as a biological tool, this perspective suggests that the heart is a primary organ of perception. Instead of just thinking logically with our brains, we can use our emotional hearts to directly perceive, understand, and communicate with the world and the living environment around us. So I think this is also sort of the part of telepathy, right? And there's, these hormones as well, and these chemicals that, sort of are the, connecting chemicals for us. So I think in ayahuasca, the vine has these harmaline energies, and they say that they open the empathic and the telepathic aspects of our experience. So, and again, it's very heart-centered, the plant medicines, and especially ayahuasca. So rather than viewing the heart merely as a biological tool, right, then we're realizing, oh, this is the direct source of presence and understanding and communication, probably also with our guides, our spirit guides, our ancestors, I don't know, the unseen world, right, as well as the living world around us. and as well as the internal world of our biological system. So I think we have this huge greater capacity. We've always talked about only learning using a small part of our brain, but I think that's going to get activated when we understand the heart in this way as it's more a function. So there's some uh, ways also to, like look at it as this bioelectric magnetic field, right? And so it has electrical strength. So the heart's electrical field is about 60 times stronger than the brain's field. It has magnetic strength. The heart's magnetic field is up to 5,000 times stronger than the brain's field. And it has sphere of influence. So this field, radiates this 360 degrees around the body, extending 3 to 12 feet out into space. It can be measured using sensitive medical instruments called SQUIDs, superconducting quantum interference devices. And then it has this field-to-field communication that's probably unconscious, subliminal to our, understanding, our awareness, right? But because this electromagnetic field projects outside of the skin, it serves as a continuous silent communication system between living beings. So emotional broadcasting. Our emotional states change the quality of the electromagnetic frequency of the heart. Frustration creates jagged, chaotic frequencies. Appreciation creates smooth, harmonic frequencies. Biomagnetic synchrony. When two people are close together, or an animal and a person, the magnetic field of one person's heart can measurably influence and synchronize the heart waves and the brain waves of the other, right? So there's this, and we know that, even the heart cells, like they do that. Like they can beat, if they're separated, they will beat their own, but they come together and they synchronize. And so there's something deeply, connective in all of that. And then there's this idea also that, the physical structure of the heart and the blood enhances its energetic capacity. The heart is like a vortex, and it doesn't push blood like a piston. It twists it into a spinning vortex when it beats. And then, this connective tissue and the blood vessels, they also behave like liquid crystals. There's a fourth stage of water that is actually a kind of liquid crystalline stage that they're studying more and is coming more into our awareness now. And these structured forms are highly conductive to electrical charges and vibrational frequencies. And then there's information storage, and we're learning more and more. And next time I'm going to do something about the mystery of water. I think water is really fascinating, and there's a theory that water is consciousness. It's not conscious; it is consciousness. So we'll go into that in our next one next week, 2 weeks from now. So these water molecules within the blood store and transmit vibrational information. And as blood spirals through the heart, it is exposed to the heart's immense electromagnetic field, so it's imprinting the body's cells with the heart's energetic state. And then the heart is also a holographic processor, as a theory, I think, that they're looking into. So there's studies by the HeartMath Institute that show that the heart often registers emotional events seconds before they actually occur. So there's a kind of non-local perception, or maybe a quantum way that we're collapsing the events, or something, but somehow the heart is seen to be registering these emotional events just instants before they're actually occurring. So, and then there's this intuitive radar. The energetic heart perceives changes in the surrounding environment instantly, sending the energetic signals to the brain before the brain's logical centers can process them through the physical senses. So again, our intuition, like we get like I'm driving along, in a largely unconscious state, and something all of a sudden, like wakes me up, right? Brings me back, comes into, being present again. Or, there's an awareness, right, that something is here, but I may have to sit with it, go in and to the felt sense of it, and be with it for a while to like bring it across that barrier of the brain into, named perception, right? Um, and some of the work that we do here kind of works with that, with the focusing and interrelationship work internally. So it all, begins to weave together. And again, that's part of the nature of nature. So, you know, we want to develop all of these capacities, and it's not always so easy to make this shift because our culture is, like sort of really, we've been trained since children to predominantly process through our mental functions and largely to kind of dampen down or ignore anything else. So there is a kind of learning curve and reawakening of certain of our capacities. And in the beginning, it can be maybe a little frustrating, but it's been my experience that, if you take your time and just keep kind of exploring and working with it, that, you can develop this in a good way. And I think it's really easier and takes less than sort of a meditational discipline, or, working with doing that, in the same way you kind of have to practice. So when we do a practice, I'm going to be doing a practice this evening. So if anybody wants to join us, you can email me at earthwalkways@gmail.com, and I'll send you the link. And so we're, working on just listening to ourselves. So there's some interesting little processes that we can explore together, to make it, see how you do with some of these practices and just notice how it is for you. So there's partly, we have to shift the gateway, right, which is our physical focus. So the brain dominates because our attention, we're always listening to our thoughts, and so our attention rests in our head or somewhere around our head. And so to change our perception, we have to like physically anchor our awareness in the chest, in the heart area, right? So it's kind of like you can just notice. I mean, some for some people, oh, it's just okay. So I'm up here now. I can, follow, pay attention to my chest, feel my chest, like maybe follow my breath, because my breath is largely happening in the chest. As the chest expands and takes in breath, it kind of brings you into the present moment and into the body, into the physical. And so that's a practice, and again, some people even have trouble with that, like, like they're kind of cut off from, the neck down. And so again, it's like, be patient with yourself, and, see, you can place your hand, as I'm doing, over your heart center. The physical touch kind of forces the nervous system to redirect the neural traffic to this specific area. Again, breathing maybe slightly deeper and slower than usual, or just noticing. Like sometimes it's always interesting to me to just notice, okay, I just took a breath and now I'm not breathing. I don't want to breathe. I have no impulse to breathe. And how long am I not going to breathe, until I breathe again, right? So there's a kind of way of just being with a natural flow of the breath, or changing the, sort of default way of breathing and making it a little slower than usual or whatever. And then you can imagine your breath flowing in and out directly through your chest, right? It's like you're not, we know we're breathing through our mouth and nose or whatever, but you can actually, as the chest rises and falls, sort of imagine that, there's energy coming directly, and that energy contains also the breath of the air. And that can anchor us, connect us more deeply to the heart area. And then slowing down, right, helps connect us to the vagus nerve. So count to 5 on the inhale, and then 5 on the exhale. And sometimes people add the holds in between, right? And this instantly signals the vagus nerve to calm the analytic fight or flight brain, right? And so that drops us into the rest digest, into the, space of just, being. And, again, a lot of times I think we're disconnected to the physical in some sense, or ourself in that way. And so we try to do that and we don't think, well, there's nothing here and it's boring. So I leave and go back up into my mind and let my attention dwell there, because there's always interesting thoughts going on, right? So again, you have to see it as mostly like kind of any perceptual capacity. It will increase a little with, or a lot with practice. Like you can think of wine tasters or anybody that's developed a skill, it's like it really can, be increased a lot just by, paying attention and practicing. And so, like the wine, I can't, all wines pretty much, I hardly can tell a difference, but other people that have developed their palate, have practiced and, learned this, they can, sense, just a huge level of reality just in the sip of a wine, right? And so, like for me, I can go into my physical, into my sensory inner body, and it's like that. There's so much there, so nuanced, so many things happening. It's a whole world in and of itself. And for other people, it takes a while to realize how much is going on down there, and to bring our awareness to where it can sort of rest. And I think some of it is like our fear again of hurt, of not wanting to be in the body, because that's where discomfort lives, where pain lives. So we tend to resist living from that space of our sensory. So the other thing that we're doing, both by focusing there, but sometimes people like use this as a way to deepen the focus, is to quiet the internal dialogue. So sometimes this can be an endless fight. So if it's not natural for you, don't worry about it. But some people are able to shift. And so brain-based perception relies on words, labels, categorization. Heart-based perception really relies on this direct nonverbal experience. And so when we drop the labels, right? So looking at an object, a plant, a person, see if you can consciously not name it. Instead of thinking this is an oak tree, or this reminds me of an oak tree I saw, look at it immediately now. It's perceived, the direct shape, the texture, the presence. And it's a direct perception. That's what Stephen Herod Booner meant with the direct perception of the heart. No words. The words are like a veil coming between you and the experience of the world. And the heart knows this experience and has this rich capacity that we haven't learned yet fully to open. But the world is helping us. We're moving in that direction. And so also we can tune in, like, since we're mostly listening to ourselves in these ways, some people are more visual and watching images, but like if you listen to the environment, not to analyze what's making the noise, but to just feel the physical vibration of the sound landing in your eardrum, on your skin, on your chest, right? Like I feel almost all sound penetrates my whole being, and it's a very rich, experience of sound. Now, again, I have to be paying attention. My attention needs to be directed into this present moment sensory realm. But if I am fully present there, the beauty and the power and the presence of life and nature and everything is amazing, right? And as we get more present, it becomes more present to us, and there is an interaction that you can begin to experience, which is very, very beautiful. It's what we're missing. As children, we went in and we knew that interaction, or we imagined it. We were playing with imaginary beings or fairies, or the flow of the water, in ways that, we saw everything as sentient, as alive, as aware. And I think that was the truth, right? That we intuitively understood. So the other thing you can do is you can activate heart-based emotions. And so the brain processes data through logic. The heart processes data through feeling tones. I like that term, feeling tones, felt senses. You must deliberately switch the operational channel. So, one way to do this is you can evoke appreciation. Think of a person, place, or pet, and in this way I would say image them, right? Bring them back to mind in some way that you really feel unconditional love for. You really naturally, just opens your heart. And allow the warm physical feeling of appreciation or gratitude to just flood your chest. And that's also something that I find easy in nature. The beauty is there so much, that it just evokes this depth of appreciation. And I feel like I'm in this beautiful flow of energetic, gratitude and love and appreciation that's just all uniting me with, the beauty and everything around. So the other thing is that we can broadcast outwards. So once you feel that warmth, it's like it's a state of being that you're holding, and if you can, maintain it, then that there's a way that, you can intend it to, radiate, or you can allow it to radiate, or, you can just know that it is radiating, sometimes I think is probably closer to the truth, so that you're filling up the room in some way, with this energy. And in a sense, it's useful because you can hold these spaces inside of yourself, as a support for others. It's like, again, this natural entrainment of the heart, right? And so if you're in a calm space and somebody is agitated or upset, if you can hold that space of calmness, I think you can, unless they're like totally unconsciously triggered out of the present moment completely, you can help them return into, sort of their own space of balance and grounding and calm. So there's a practice for this direct perception, this aesthesis. It's spelled Aisthesis. I guess I should listen to how it's pronounced. Aesthesis, I think. Aesthesis. It's a Greek word. And Stephen Harad Booner emphasized that the heart perceives this unique essence of other living things through a resonance loop. So he suggests that we have a soft gaze, that we unfocus the eyes slightly and allow the vision to kind of go wide. It's like, so you're seeing like, a wide angle, soft focus sort of perception. And, in our culture, again, we're taught to look at the TV, at the teacher, at the person talking. And so we have a kind of pinpoint practice of our focus. And so this is kind of, again, doing something a little unusual, like by allowing that vision to go wide. And this helps stop the brain's analytical tracking and opens up the sensory process. And then you can ask a feeling question. So often we ask the brain, what is this? Ask your heart, how does this feel? Or what is the mood of this space? And then as you pay attention, there's maybe you can notice a shift, that there's subtle shifts in your emotional state. Stomach, chest, the heart registers the environment as a feeling or an intuitive flash rather than a spoken thought. And so we can begin noticing how the body is reacting. And the truth is that the body is reacting to every thought we think. So even if we're thinking, if we take a minute and check in with the body, like, it's very instructive to see how the body is reacting to all of our thinking. So, and then the biggest obstacle to heart-based perception is the analytical brain jumping in, dismissing the heart's input. It's just your imagination, or, that's soft or, too sensitive or something, so we reject sort of the heart's data. So record first, analyze later is one way to work with this. Write down your heart-based impressions, physical sensations, and intuitive hits immediately without editing them. And also treat insights as data. Acknowledge that a sudden feeling of peace, a sudden urge to move, or a flash of insight is real information picked up by your heart's electromagnetic radar. I mean, where do half of our thoughts and our insights and our understandings come from? I think, again, that's the signal of the heart sending information up to the brain, right? That there's this, deep wisdom and knowing capacity of the heart that we're learning now how to activate. So, I'm going to do a couple more little instructions, and then we're going to kind of wind this whole thing back up. I guess we're going to run over our hour a little bit, but I think it's worth continuing. So there's also this way of being with each other, in these heart spaces, right? And so there's a kind of alignment, applying heart-based perception to communication, right? To the connection with each other is often called interpersonal coherence. And it shifts conversations from a battle of intellects, brain to brain, to a space of mutual resonance, heart to heart. So here's how to use this shift before, during, and after a conversation. So there's a kind of pre-communication alignment. We got to remember to do this, or we won't. Before you engage with somebody, especially if the conversation might be difficult, you must prepare your energetic field. Establish coherence. Spend 60 seconds practicing heart-focused breathing, inhaling and exhaling through the chest. Set the field in tension. Actively evoke a feeling of genuine respect, care, or neutral openness towards the person. Drop the script. Stop rehearsing what you're going to say. Rehearsing locks you into your analytical brain and closes your sensory radar. So then, step 2, practice heart-focused listening. Most people listen with their brains to formulate a rebuttal. Listening with the heart means using your electromagnetic field to absorb the other person's emotional state. Now, again, you don't need to be their dialysis machine or take care of them, but you need to register. You need to sort of see, acknowledge what's here. What is this? Anchor your awareness. So while they speak, keep a small percentage of your attention anchored in your own test. This keeps you grounded and prevents you from absorbing their anxiety or anger. Listen to the tone, not just words. Pay attention to the cadence, pauses, and vibrational frequency of their voice. The heart decodes the feeling behind the words, revealing if they are actually scared, tired, or seeking validation, right? We can sense these things, right? And it impacts, our ability to receive what we're being told and how to, relate. So receive with the chest. Imagine their words and emotional energy landing gently on your heart center rather than hitting your head as a logical puzzle to solve. So those are just some, good suggestions, right? To be in this heart-focused listening. And, when we do our own, internal heart-focused listening, there's a little prompt that I like, that is saying something in me wants my attention, right? That opens my curious, compassionate, open presence to go in and see what's happening. And so maybe something similar, it's like I notice something in them is asking for attention. And so that we can kind of come from a place of, like it said, neutrality, or at best, or at least, and then or positive connection in some way. Oftentimes, these moods and tones that we feel and their energies are coming from their defenses. And of course, when one person is in their defensive state, it can trigger, it's likely to trigger mostly, unless you're conscious, your own defense, right? So they kind of bounce off of each other. Again, there's a resonance in the defenses. So, if you can be aware of that also and come back in, trusting that maybe, it had resonance with old pain state, right, from another experience that had a similar tonality in the voice or something like that made you believe that's what was going on in this moment, was what was happening when you remember that. So usually that's it's confusing because it's often a projection, because we're highly defended around those things, and we hear that defense, and our defense wakes up, and it's like a bait, and the fish hits the bait immediately. And so, we let it play out till it tires itself, and then we can come back and work with the going back into the heart connection, and seeing what just happened. Like we can clear that, we can understand that, we can heal that, in that moment, even through this heart process. So there's a way then to speak from the heart. We've listened from the heart. Now, when it is your turn to speak, pause for 1 second to let the response rise from your chest rather than your intellect. Use feeling language. Instead of saying, I think your logic is flawed, try saying, my sense is, or what I'm feeling from this situation is. Match and refine frequencies. If the other person is highly agitated, do not match their chaotic frequency. Maintain your calm, coherent heart rhythm. Because the heart's magnetic field is so strong, your internal calm can naturally soothe and regulate their nervous system through biomagnetic synchrony. And then speak truth without defense, right? The truth is all of what is ever needed, and it's a powerful teaching in the path work as well. So if we speak truth, we don't need defense. And heart-based speech is direct and compassionate, and it lacks the sharp defensive edge generated by the mind, the ego-driven brain. And then also decode the silent signals. Because the energetic heart functions as a holographic radar, it picks up subtext instantly. So trust the first impressions. Notice the very first physical sensation or emotion you feel when stepping into someone's presence. The initial flash is your heart reading their field before your brain rationalizes it. Watch for autonomic resonation. If your chest suddenly tightens or your breathing changes while someone is talking, your heart is mirroring their hidden internal signal. Use this data to respond with empathy. It feels like there's a lot of pressure on you right now. So again, we can read other people, and again, it's sort of like we do this best where we are not in an area where we've had trauma or wounding. Where we are still working on our wounding and our trauma, oftentimes it's a little more difficult to, clearly read our intuitive truth. Now, intuition, the guide interestingly says, is the result of working with our feelings, transforming them out of the defense. And he says that, our feelings become our deepest intuition. So where we still have reactive kinds of feelings, we can kind of assume that, that's not the intuition. These senses that they're describing here, we perceive, but we don't react to. And I think that's how you can tell, okay, so I'm really reading something from them rather than, having a reaction myself. Okay, so this is going to conclude this section. I think it's, very beautiful and interesting to understand all of these new things and work with them. But I want to return back to the central sun and the way of nature, and back to the natural processes of expansion and the way nature handles this force of expansion, because nature is a good teacher, right? And when we're having these larger questions of, like, how do we navigate these circumstances, it's always beautiful to look to nature. So in the question of war, you know, nature doesn't exactly go to war the way we do, right? Nature has disputes, but she doesn't go to war in this way that we think of it. She allows everything its place and keeps balance. And that balance can also be a kind of a border. And you can have a skirmish over territory in nature. You can have species competing within species or between species. And in that competition, you can kind of see that as a form of war in nature, right? And, there is a survival of the fittest. But that's like this one level. And then there's this other layer that's way, way deeper, that is this continuous collaboration and cooperation between and within species that is actually weaving together into a dynamic, growing, and ever balancing fabric. It's always in movement, and there are, incursions and rebalancing, and, but in some ways, the harmony and the peace, and it's not taken personally, and it's not, I mean, humans do. I still take personally sort of when I see natural pecking orders in nature, right? It's like, I want everybody to be equal, and nature, the animals still, they function in this state of consciousness, which is part of their balance in nature, and maybe it's human too. I still have that as an open question, but in my heart of hearts, I believe that we can move into a different kind of organization and connection with each other that is truly, holographic, and we're all holons, and we're all parts of other holons, and there's a dynamic and beautiful way of, I think, balancing that nature also does, that we're trying to now find and learn from. But we have uh, the conditions that get way out of balance, which is currently our situation, mostly reflecting our human presence, and then what is the right action to rebalance? I think, we have tried from our science, and maybe eventually it will have that level of sensitivity, but I think it's better to work with nature instead of trying to superimpose any of our, again, mental understanding or our categories. And so I think, again, it's like listening, and there are ways that maybe we have yet to realize that we can hear nature. Again, Stephen Harrod Booner believed that very much, and there are forms of gardening that rely on communicating with the devas and the nature spirits, and, increasing crop yields and doing sort of miraculous things with gardening when we have that sensitivity, that intuitive connection, that greater awareness. And nature, she has a memory and has a past, but she doesn't live from that brain and that kind of, she doesn't have that kind of connection to the past and the defense around the past and the wound around the past. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but you can see that she's just sort of in the moment. And we are too, but a lot of times through our memory. And again, nature has memory, genes have memory, water has memory. We know that there's memory of all kinds in nature. But there's something about the human memory that seems to, get us trapped. And so nature lives not from a brain, and I think it's our story, it's our brain and our trauma that somehow gets caught in a loop. Um, but nature lives from a kind of sensory moment to moment immersion. And I think for the most part, it probably feels deeply pleasurable and fulfilling. It's like she's just in the midst of herself and all of it, right? Um, and then, sometimes there can be suffering in that as well. Everything dies, everything, you know, uh, suffers through droughts and through, difficult situations in life. And again, that seems to help build the resilience and strengthen the overall aspect. So I want to share like the words of a hymn from the Santo Daime tradition. I think about how the forest speaks, to this kind of harmonizing and this balancing and this gift that it is to us. Um, and it says, "From the forest I receive strength to work. From the forest I have everything, everything she gives me. What a splendor is the forest in the way that it is made. With love it harmonizes, and it leaves the earth satisfied." So I always, I hear this line in two different ways. I hear that it expresses love and harmonizes its environment and harmonizes everything. And in doing that, it gives to us and leaves the earth herself satisfied. But I also hear it as, through its loving, harmonizing activity, it feels very complete in its life. And so it leaves the earth not in grief or despair at the end of life, but it leaves deeply satisfied. So I like that image. And then the words continue, "We must live on this earth with total satisfaction. And if we want to have love, we must give thanks to our mother." So that's that space of appreciation and remembering all that is here and that we receive, and being open, being receptive. And that means being sensory. So does that mean that the forest doesn't have defenses against pests and invasive species and stuff? It's they are an imbalance because there aren't the normal natural defenses. But how are these defenses different than human defenses? I don't think nature goes into separation from what it is defending. There's a boundary that nature creates, and when you can have boundary, I think it helps not having war. And if we're going to war, we're probably going to war over a disputed boundary in some way, and when you have a boundary and it is sort of an ongoing negotiation, moment to moment, but it is in relationship. It's not really seeking the annihilation of the obstacle, but it's seeking a balance and a harmony with it, or a, way to contain, the whole thing. And, it's a study because what we see in the human, you know, kind of puzzles us of how you might apply something like this. But I think, if we can really understand that when we get triggered, when something invades us, we usually, like go into the defense, right? And then from the defense, we go into separation. That's bad. I hate that guy. That's, gonna, cause the end of the civilization. We gotta fight it. We gotta hate it. We gotta, defend ourselves. But that defense is, by annihilating the other side. And we're seeing that particularly, with the Jewish and Palestinian situation, which, and it's like, this is not natural. You don't sort of win in nature by annihilating completely the other. And I guess, extinction events do happen in nature, but I think that that's, like either a huge transition that's happening, so that the whole thing is about something to create something totally different than what it was, or there is an imbalance that, you know, is still maybe in its natural phase of rebalancing. We can't, we see things through a very tiny keyhole, so we don't have the larger geological time perspective, that a lot of this change happens in. But it also, happens through these, like humanity now is a global force, and everything that we do, is creating imbalance. And so there is, the earth trying to balance against our imbalance. And, there's a way that I think as we can let go of our fears and our needs for conquest and war and annihilating of anything, even our way of dealing, with weed killers and bug killers, it's like nature needs those weeds and those bugs, right? And it's not about, somehow we have to find a way to learn to share and have enough. And I think nature can show us how to do that. So I think the way of the heart is the one that, is the least explored path, and yet has the most potential. And it's this way of generosity and generativity of the sun. The sun is just pouring oceans. It's like burning oceans of matter, moment to moment, radiating its light out into the cosmos. And, everything that happens on Earth happens because of this energy from the sun. And in a way, it is sort of self-sacrificing, right? But yet that sacrifice is, not resented. It's like the beautiful passion of moving itself, expanding itself, sharing itself, giving forth of itself for what the heart loves, for what the sun loves. And I think the sun loves the earth. And the earth flowers and fruits with connectivity and creativity. And it's an endless treasure. And maybe gravity is even a kind of expression of the connection and the love between the earth and the sun. So celebrate the summer from this broader perspective and see if your heart can become like the sun. One of my hymns says, let my mind be like the blue skies, right? Let my heart be like the sun. And then let my voice be united, 3 in 1. So let's find our own way of flowering and fruiting into life, of making love and learning how to dance in collaboration, learning to respect and honor boundaries and needs. This is the way beyond war. I think it requires the other main quality of the direction of the South on the medicine wheel, which is trust. We have to risk, and we have to move, and we have to say yes to what is, with faith that we can find our way, and that path will season and temper us and bring us into full fruition. Life is an initiation, not a vacation. So may your journeys be fully met, knowing there is no such thing as a defeat, only a learning curve and growing pains. So blessings to everyone. We'll see you in 2 weeks.